If you're like me, you're probably sitting there watching YouTube with a nice cup of tea and a couple of slices of toast. But that certainly wasn't the case in 1863. Well, because they didn't have YouTube. But they also didn't have any bread. This is the story of the Stalybridge bread riots. It happened on the 20th of March, 1863. But the story of a riot over hunger isn't particularly unique in history. A bunch of starving people took to the streets protesting that they were starving. But the circumstances that brought it about are particularly fascinating. Stalybridge is now part of Greater Manchester in the north of England. And back then, Manchester was the center of the universe. The Industrial Revolution. Cotton was king, and Lancashire was the court of cotton manufacturing. But in the 1860s, another event was taking center stage: the American Civil War. The war started in April 1861. Now, some will tell you that it started as a war about states' rights, but whatever the reason, it became America's war to end slavery. Britain had abolished slavery 30 years earlier, and the movement began here at Manchester's Cathedral in 1786. The cotton workers were well aware that the last hands that touched the cotton in America were those of slaves, and they yearned for an end to this injustice. America was yet to be the superpower that it is today. In the 1860s, Britannia ruled the waves. Both the Union and the Confederacy wanted Britain to take sides in the war and sought its support. At the time, 500,000 people were employed in the cotton mills of Lancashire, and nearly that many again worked in some industry that supplied the cotton manufacturers in one way or another. Over 70% of the cotton produced in America ended up in the mills of Lancashire. South Carolina Senator James Henry Hammond said in a speech leading up to the war, "Without firing a gun, without drawing a sword, should they make war on us, we could bring the whole world to our feet. What would happen if no cotton were furnished for 3 years? England would topple headlong and carry the whole civilized world with her to save the South. No, you dare not make war on cotton. No power on earth dares to make war upon it. Cotton is king." The Union took the same approach and adopted Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan. They blockaded the Confederate ports, cutting off the cotton supply in hope that it would bring Britain in on the side of the North. Both sides knew Britain couldn't last long without American cotton. In 1860, there was a bumper crop of cotton. British warehouses were overflowing, and Britain adopted a wait-and-see attitude while these supplies lasted. But that surplus didn't last long. When the Union blockade cut off these vital supplies, the effects were catastrophic. One by one, the factories of Lancashire fell silent. Stalybridge reflected what was happening across Lancashire. Out of the town's 64 factories, only 5 were able to continue operations, and only on a part-time basis. The rest shut down entirely. A staggering 7,000 people, nearly 3/4 of the population, found themselves without work. Homes were abandoned, families were evicted, and people were literally starving. Across Lancashire, over 1 million people were without work. In Stalybridge, it became known as the Great Panic. Today, we call it the Cotton Famine. With the second winter of the war upon them, a meeting was called at Stalybridge Town Hall in October 1862. Nothing would come of it. The Poor Law was ineffective, but what could one do about that? The only outcome was blame. A resolution declared the Confederacy was responsible for the suffering. On New Year's Eve that same year, a similar meeting was held at Manchester's Free Trade Hall. The outcome? The same. But a letter was drafted and sent to President Lincoln, condemning the South and pledging their support for the Union's cause. One worker was heard saying he would rather starve than support a slave owner. Lincoln was so moved by the letter and the self-sacrifice of the working men of Manchester that he sent a reply. Lincoln's words, later inscribed on the pedestal of his statue, can still be found in Lincoln Square, Manchester. He praised the workers for their selfless act of sublime Christian heroism, which has not been surpassed in any age or in any country. It was letters like this that kept Britain out of the war. The country was divided. Many wanted to see Britain join the Confederates and bring an end to the cotton famine. Despite their suffering, the workers refused to support the Confederacy, helping keep Britain out of the war. This was a pivotal moment in history. Had Britain intervened on the side of the Confederates, we'd be living in a very different world. If you want to learn more about it, click the link or check the description for one. Lincoln managed to get some support for the starving people of Lancashire. He sent the ship the George Griswold with a cargo that included boxes of bacon and bread, bags of rice and corn, and 15,000 barrels of flour. All this at a time when his own people and troops were in desperate need. However, the situation continued to deteriorate. On March 10, 1863, 10,000 loaves of bread made from that flour arrived in Manchester. As the crowd gathered to collect the food, a feeling of resentment boiled over. The distribution of this desperately needed food turned into a disaster. It seemed that there was something derogatory in being drawn after these bread-laden wagons, like donkeys after a bunch of carrots. A row ensued, loaves were thrown about, were trodden upon, and the meeting was broken up. The day after the bread fiasco, the Poor Law Executive Committee reduced relief payments. Now, they were already in a desperate state. They were forced to wear donated clothing marked for identification like prisoners in a concentration camp. Proud men and women who had once worked hard to provide for their families were now forced to stand in line, cap in hand, waiting for scraps from the tables of the wealthy. Their dignity was worn as thin as their pockets. They were reduced to begging. They were treated like criminals looking for a handout. The authorities treated them with disdain, requiring them to perform pointless tasks like digging holes and filling them back in to receive their relief aid. The final straw came on the 19th of March, 1863, when relief payments were stopped and replaced with vouchers to be exchanged for food items in local shops. Those in receipt of relief held a meeting and decided to refuse both the reduction and the ticket system. And then the rioting began. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail about the riot itself. It was a riot. Shops were broken into, there was vandalism and fire set. Troops on horseback brandishing sabers broke up the scene, just like they had at Peterloo decades before. But luckily this time there was no fatalities. The Riot Act was read, and the Stalybridge bread riots were over. History can make fictionalized characters out of people. Like this all took place a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. It's easy to forget that these were real people with real lives and families struggling to survive. It was a riot born out of desperation, not malice. These were not criminals, but proud, hard-working men and women like yourself. They'd fallen victim to forces beyond their control. They didn't have much, but what they had, they'd earned through their own hard labor. Now, on that cheery note, I hope you haven't choked on your toast. How does one end a video like this? Watch this one next to get the taste of stale riot bread out of your mouth. I promise it's just a bit of lighthearted fun. And if you're in the market for a nice mug to sip your brew, why not check out the Wicked Acorn Collection? A touch of Manchester pride to go with your brew.